All right, good morning, everybody. So this is Mr. Gerber talking about kind of our World War II home front information here. So stuff that we wouldn't gone over in class, and some of the assignments that you're going to have will go right along with the study guide, and then also the extra stuff that's on Schoology will be posted alongside this to kind of help background this information that's also found in the book, and with the extra readings and assignments that will be uploaded as well. So we're talking about, so we've covered already in class before we have our little break here from the classroom, everything that's kind of led up to World War II. So we talked about obviously the rise of the dictators. We've talked about Hitler and use of the Blitzkrieg. We talked about the United States' response, slowly getting ready for war while trying to not get into the war. So essentially, we're preparing for war. We're, getting the U.S. ready to go. And aiding, Great Britain, China, for the most part, and then the Soviet Union. We didn't really talk about that, but the Soviet Union gets attacked about 6 months prior to Pearl Harbor by the Nazis, and so that we find ourselves aiding a lot of countries around the world against the Axis powers, being Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, as they are starting to prep. And then we also looked at the fact that while the United States is primarily focusing on Germany, we do take steps to try and limit Japanese expansion by preventing Japan from getting oil and other needed essentials prior to their attack on Pearl Harbor, which they do once they realize that the U.S. is not going to back down. So once that actually happens, we have to start figuring out how we're going to get the U.S. actually into and prepared for the war. So this lesson is going to describe the economic and social steps that the U.S. took to produce enough to win the war, and then evaluating the economic and social impacts of the war, including its impact on the role of women and disenfranchised communities inside the United States. So we're looking at the economic steps, but also how this affected various social groups as a result of the war. So essentially, this is the home front section that we are going to be looking at here. So if we were in class, we'd obviously have you look at creating a list that Americans did to support the World War I effort, because in many ways it's very similar to what we do in World War II, just on a much bigger scale. In World War I, we're at war for about a year and a half, and really only fighting for about 6 months over in France. In World War II, obviously, we get attacked at Pearl Harbor, so we're fighting from the very end of December 1941 up until beginning of August 1945, and it's a much more global scale, and it takes a lot longer, and a lot more effort, and a lot more money, troop supplies, to get ourselves into World War II, which is an entirely different type of war than World War I, where World War I is based primarily on trench warfare. World War II, so many things have changed, as we've seen, that have kind of created ourselves into a different situation that we need to prepare ourselves for. So we talk about managing the war. So government control was essentially very similar with the economy with World War I, going from the consumer to war products. So again, limiting consumer products in terms of cars. Instead of cars, we're making tanks. A lot more leisurely stuff is obviously put on hold. There's a lot more price controls as well. So the government's dictating wages, working hours, working with labor unions to ensure that nobody goes on strike because of the dire need of the war at this point, especially early on in 1942 and the beginnings of 1943. Things are not going well for the Allies, or it's continually not going well. And the United States is trying to promote and get ourselves slowly invested, slowly get ourselves ready here, because we're not ready to go on the offensive really up until halfway through towards the end of 1942. So almost a full year before we even engage with the Nazis on any landscape. And then, the Japanese obviously are expanding into a lot of places in Asia and going into territories held by the United States, but we have to kind of play more a defensive role. So it takes time again to get ourselves moving towards this. And it begun prior to the war. That's why we talk about Lend-Lease, and we talk about all the aid we were giving the Allies, but that had started before, but now it needs to jump full scale into it. So the government control was very much in the same manner of what we talked about with the World War I unit in trimester 2. So the increased production is what actually ends up bringing the United States out of the Great Depression. Remember, we're still hovering around 10 to 15% unemployment, 1939, 1940, and then it's going into World War II and having to really fully employ the entirety of the population into the economy somehow. That brings us out of the Depression, raises government spending even more so than the New Deal, but also gives people more jobs, a purpose for work. There's never enough jobs going around at this point. So everything kind of the whole war effort brings us out of the Depression finally and brings unemployment down to like 1 or 2% at the very height of all of it. So obviously we need a lot of jobs to supply with those wage increases to create huge armories, supplies, and food to fight the Axis powers. Very similar again, as we said, World War I. On top of that, while it's not in the notes here, it is in the book, and kind of an interesting fact is that the government is offering what we call cost plus contracts. All right, and it's not really mentioned here. I used to have it in, but I kind of cut it out. And what those cost plus contracts are, it's just kind of more side note, is that the government was guaranteeing that the companies are going to get paid for all their efforts plus profit later on. So remember that the United States does not have essentially, its own, like, there's no government tank facility, there's no government shipbuilding facility, airplanes, bullets. Like, this is all stuff that's made by private corporations and companies that the government has to pay for all of this and to hire workers and stuff. So the government is paying all of these like we do today. We still, even to this day, we, there's productions that build fighter jets, bombs, bullets, equipment for our soldiers. All that comes from private companies. And so that continues here to, obviously, again, a much grander scale. All right. So how we're paying for the war, again, because like we are coming out of it, like we talked about with the Great Depression and the New Deal, with taxes. But now war bonds, just like we talked about with World War I, end up paying for a very large, substantial part of the World War II finances. 55% of them are paid with war bonds. Taxes pay for the other 45%. And so we're going to look at some bond stuff here in a few minutes, or in a little bit, as we kind of keep going with this. So obviously we ask citizens to ration goods that are essential to the war effort, and we'll look at some examples of those going forward. One example of that we're going to look at is a rationing book. So essentially, you get a number of coupons per month that limits you to buying certain products, and essentially it's like you can only buy 5 cents of this, 10 cents of that, and when you run out, that means you can't buy it for the rest of the month. So you got to be paying close attention to what you can buy on those rationing goods. So that's how we're, again, asking citizens to cut back on what they are doing. Think about what we're asking you to do now, here in March and April of 2020, asking people to, cut back due to the coronavirus stuff, that we're asking you to only buy the essentials when you go to the store, and to ration people's ability to buy canned goods, toilet paper in particular. If you've been paying attention to the news or gone to the store with your families lately, that's what we're asking them to do, much in the way that we were doing in World War II. All right, so the big things that were being rationed, and again, we'll look at the coupons here in a minute. Gasoline, sugar, meat, tires, oil. All right, again, the essential things that are really important, but again, you're limiting the amount that you can buy. Now, certain people obviously get different extensions. If you're a doctor, you get more gasoline than anybody else. Same thing with tires. If you are a butcher, obviously you can make more meat, or you have the ability to buy more meat. Again, it varies based on family and occupation. All right, and so other things that the government promotes to really try and get us there, use of victory gardens, recycling, carpools, again, all in which to help with the war effort. So here's kind of a look at some of the rationing coupons here. So ration for 5 points. So this is essentially the limit on what you can get is meat, fish, fats, and cheeses, 5 pounds of sugar. So once you run out of this, that's whatever's in the coupon book for that month, then it is limited to that. Once you're done, this is what you bought for the time being, and you have to wait a whole nother month. And so luckily, if you save them up, you can kind of use them more often than that. But usually, this is stuff that you're making at home. We were not as much on the processed foods at this point. So again, you had to be very wise on what you were limiting. So the more food that you made on your own, i.e. the victory gardens, the more you could supply your family without having to go to the store as much. So this clip right here is more about the war bond stuff. You really should take a look at it. It's from the movie Flags of Our Fathers. That does a really good job conveying the importance of the war bond drives, especially late in 1945, to help pay for the war. There is one little bit in criticism I'll say with that, because they talk about how not being able to pay for it and that they'll have to stop production. We were never going to stop producing stuff for the war. It was how we were going to pay for it. And when they talk about the issues of debt and taxes and everything else, it's a really good 2.5-minute clip. I'm not going to lie, there are some obscenity words in there, but I think it does a really good job conveying, the issue of propaganda with those in the propaganda itself as soldiers. So some examples here, obviously getting the Looney Tunes involved. We get Captain America. He was actually created in World War II, for those that do not know, and like the Avengers, Captain America was initially created at this time, especially the comics. All right, prior to Marvel being invented, he was essentially used for, pro-propaganda for kids. All right, the really famous actor, Mark Clark, or not Mark Clark. He was a general in Italy. Mark Clark Gable obviously was being used in a lot of different, propaganda movies. So was future President Ronald Reagan. Here we got Sergeant John Basilone. If you ever read the book The Pacific, or you've seen the miniseries from HBO, it's about 10 years old now. It's really, really good. Talking about him, Medal of Honor winner for his work on Guadalcanal. And then obviously getting celebrities to pitch in for war bonds, for fundraisers, stuff like that. Much in the same way that we're kind of seeing people kind of group together now to promote, the stuff with the coronavirus and, being aware about social distancing, fundraising for all these other people that, currently unemployed to help provide for them. So, propaganda, we've seen film and advertising to keep people informed on the war, help shape the opinion. So, obviously very biased towards the U.S., but, it's not like Germany and Italy and Japan didn't have these either. Every country does it. So one of the things that we showed, I don't know if it's on Netflix anymore. I haven't really checked that out too much. It used to be a few years back, but you can definitely find it all on YouTube, was the Why We Fight. So essentially, the War Department was creating propaganda films to show why the Axis powers are evil, painting the Allies as fighting for freedom, and painting the United States in a very good light, and showing all the atrocities, and going in pretty good detail for the stuff that goes on. Like a lot of episodes about, how the Axis powers came up. So that's a very good video to watch if you're interested. Obviously, you got to be very aware of the bias in there because of the way it paints America in this angelic light with everything. So they talk about Pearl Harbor in one episode, Russia, Britain, the fight in China, how the Nazis really took over Europe. There's a lot of great stuff in there. Obviously based at the time of the war, so it's all real. I mean, there's some, actual movie clips in there too. But it's really cool to check out, especially if you got the time now. Check out the Why We Fight stuff. And we actually looked a bit of that when we looked at the Blitzkrieg film, when they talk about how the Nazis were able to get in through France and kind of force the Allies back early in 1940. So, obviously the posters, you give us the fire, we'll give them hell. Talking about, everyone needs to pitch in. Every time you twist a nut, think of Hitler, so work harder because you're thinking about what you want to do to that guy. Using actual people, again. So right here, Twice a Patriot, using O.B. Bartlett, lost his arm at Pearl Harbor, now working in a West Coast shipyard with welding. Sometimes I feel my job here is important as the one I left because he's still able to contribute, even though he is, in fact, with just one functional arm at this point. And actually, the use of people of color in this point is also really important, too, to the entire war effort. So this is kind of talking about the importance of carpooling. Hitler rides in the empty seat, double up. That way everyone's transporting together. You don't need to use as much gasoline, as much tire, fuel, all that stuff. So essentially, riding alone is bad for the country. All right, really cool Walt Disney thing here. Is Donald Duck a Nazi? Really good propaganda. I think, if you got time again, it's going to be on there. Take a look at this. It's a very cool thing. It's called Der Führer's Face. I'm not going to lie, it gets a bit trippy at the end, and it's got a really catchy song, but it's worth taking a look at for propaganda for little kids. And we would watch it in class if we were there. So in terms of the unemployment, here we are, kind of again, 1920s. We talked about this in class. At one point it gets close to 25%. Yeah, the height of the Great Depression. Then we see the New Deal, cut back on the New Deal, 1937 recession, and then slowly again dropping. So here we are in 1940. World War II has begun globally, 15%, 10-ish%. And then, right after Pearl Harbor, we see it completely shrink as the war goes on, down to like 1 or 2%. And then, we'll talk more about that after the World War II unit. So that's where we're going to pause for this video. And then we will pick up with this one in the next lesson, talking about the Homefront afterward. So we talk about the economics in this one. Now we're going to go more with the social aspect afterward. So.